methodologies. And I think I remember where we left off. And we're trying to finish these today. Yeah, actually, I think on Tuesday I wrote experiments instead of experimental methodologies. Semantically, we're talking about the same thing. This was our big number 3. Our first thing that we did under this was just an overview, identifying, the difference between correlation and causality. Ideally, experiments are trying to demonstrate causality. But that doesn't mean they always absolutely do, and that's, certainly one of the things if you're doing an experiment for your critique that you would sort of address in your discussion section. We talked about some of the different terms and what influences how strong an experiment can explain causality or not. And then where we were into B were our specific different types of experimental designs. And our first main kind of experimental design that we were looking at was the pool experiment. And within our pool experiment, didn't we just do that first one, which is pre-test, post-test, control group, and comparison? Or did we also get through the post-test only?
No.
We did not do post-test only. Okay, so then what our first one under here was our pre-test, post-test. And we really had identified 2 different variations on the theme. One theme is a pre-test, post-test control group design, and then a variation on that is a pre-test, post-test comparison group design. And we had that on model there, where you've got your randomized distribution of subjects, and you've got your first observation and your second observation, and then you've got your exposure to the variable, no exposure to the variable, your third observation, your fourth observation. What's the difference between the pre-test, post-test control group design, except this is 2, this is 3, and pre-test, post-test comparison group? What's the difference between those 2? What's the difference between the comparison group compared to the control group?
One has the variable exposed to it and one doesn't.
What's that?
One has the variable exposed to it and one doesn't.
In the control group design like this one, this group's exposed to the variable, this group's not exposed to the variable, so that's your control group, that's your treatment group, just as a, the vocabulary term. What's different? That's the pre-test, post-test control group. What's different if you're doing the comparison group instead of control group?
The X0 has X2 or something.
What'd you say?
The second one on the bottom has X2 or...
Yeah, exactly. The difference is, when you're doing the control group, one group gets, like George said, one group gets the variable, the other group doesn't get the variable. Treatment group, control group. Like I said, if you're doing the comparison group, you don't have a control group, you have 2 treatment groups. This group gets exposed to this variable, this group gets exposed, it's still the same variable, but a variation of it. This group gets exposed to this example of the variable, this one gets exposed to this example of the variable. Again, this is probably, I gave the same kind of example, but just to quickly illustrate the difference. If we were studying the effectiveness on change of attitudes with a particular persuasive message, the X1, XO would be the treatment group gets the persuasive message, the control group gets no persuasive message. Your difference here would be this treatment group gets persuasive message A, this group gets persuasive message B, and so what you're really doing is comparing which persuasive message had the most effect. You see the difference. In one you have a treatment group and a control group, variable, no exposure to the variable. In the other one you have both groups or treatment groups. They both get exposed to the variable, but they're a different variation of the variable. And like we probably mentioned as well, this is just sort of a skeletal model. You could envision, actually, I think Lauren's the one that brought this up, you could envision an X3, an X4, an X5, on down the line. It doesn't just have to be 2. You could be comparing 5 different persuasive messages, for example, and you're just comparing all 5 groups, in which case it would still more than likely be a comparison group. Isn't that where we left off? Okay. Then our next type of full experiment, and this is just, again, a variation on the theme, and I think a lot of it would seem fairly intuitive, and that's a post-test only. And again, you have both variations, a post-test only control group, or comparison group. It's still a full experiment, so you still have the randomized distribution of subjects. And, I mean, we're saying randomized distribution, but you realize what we're really talking about here, back to our sampling stuff, we're talking about probability sampling. Any one of the types of probability sampling. I mean, it could be the systematic, it could be the stratified, it could be the simple random, it could be the cluster sampling, you know, so it doesn't just have to be that simple random. Basically, by putting this R here, it means you're using probability sampling, and it could be any one of the types of probability sampling. And like we said, you know, in class, both with sampling, and I think we mentioned on Tuesday as well, that's what gives you the strongest probability that your groups are going to be equivalent. But you do have the check, at least in the pre-test, post-test groups, you have the check to see if the groups are, are equivalent or not by that first observation. Well, with the post-test only, you have the exact same structural model, you just eliminate the pre-test. So you would have, if it's the control group, you would have X1, O1, XO, O2, okay? This is your treatment group and your observation after the treatment. This is your control group and an observation. There wouldn't be a treatment, but you still make an observation of that same kind of group. You're doing this the exact same thing as our pre-test, post-test model, except you don't have the pre-test. One of the reasons, even though you do have a check for this, by comparing the observations of the control group, one of the reasons why a lot of times people opt for this model instead of this model is pre-test sensitivity. We actually talked about that a little bit in the first unit when we were talking about, some of the things that could influence the internal validity of a study. Sometimes just the fact that people are exposed to a pre-test can influence the results that you get on a post-test. Now again, if you have a control group, you can kind of account for that by comparing the pre-test and the post-test of the control group, and that could verify that you didn't have any kind of pre-test, sensitivity. However, if you're doing the comparison group, you don't really have that ability, right? Because both groups get the pre-test, both groups get the post-test, and you don't have a control group, so you can't really see, directly, was there any kind of effect of the pre-test in terms of pre-test sensitization. So that would be one of many variations here in terms of why somebody might use this model. There's also a lot of kinds of situations where the idea of a pre-test and a post-test just don't conceptually make sense. Sometimes it would. If you're doing attitude change, it almost necessitates a pre-test, post-test, because how are you going to know what somebody's attitude change is unless you see what their attitude is beforehand, and then you see what their attitude is afterwards. But there are some kinds of studies that just conceptually don't make sense to do a pre-test. For instance, we actually talked about one of these in the first unit. I gave you that handout on that listening study. Now, we'll come back to that again, because that could also be an example of a factorial design. They really kind of summarized their results two different ways. But I gave you the results of that listening study where they took a group of listeners, or a group of subjects, and they had some of the subjects listen to a message that included pauses at strategically important points of the message. And then in the other group, there were no pauses at strategically important points in the message. And then what they assessed afterwards is how much did people remember. And what they were comparing here is, was there a difference in the amount of information that people recalled from having the treatment, strategically placed pauses, or not having strategically placed pauses? Well, there again, you couldn't really give people a pre-test. How in the world could you give people a pre-test about how much you remember from something when you haven't even heard the information yet? So, it wouldn't make any conceptual sense at all. Now, they did give the people an assessment in the beginning, but it didn't have anything to do with recall. They gave everybody the Brown-Carlson listening assessment so they could rate which people are high-quality listeners, which are average listeners, which are below average listeners. And we'll come back to that, because that could be an example of a factorial design. But just in terms of the actual comparison, did having a pause or not having a pause make a difference? Pre-test wouldn't even make sense. Again, you can't give a pre-test about how much you remember when you haven't heard the information yet. So that would be a classic example that we've actually talked about here. Here, there's not really any, doubt in terms of what observations you're comparing. Because remember on Tuesday, when we were talking about the three different comparisons you could make here, two things you would compare if you're trying to assess the effect of your variable, two different things you would compare if you're trying to verify the groups are equivalent, and two different things that you would compare to see if there was any kind of pre-test sensitization. Here you don't really have anything but two things to compare, so your observations that you're going to compare here, obviously, to see what the effect of the variable is
is simply compare O1 and O2. You know, what does this group show after the exposure? What does the other group show without having been exposed to it? Another good classic example of this kind of design, there's been similar research done, but this was really a great study that was done. There's been a lot of stuff in the past about children's vulnerability to advertising. Now, we have seen a lot of changes. You know, you that watch like Saturday morning cartoons or things like this, you know that a lot of times now, before they go into the commercial, they'll have some kind of identification like, we are now going into commercial messages. And, you know, a lot of the reason, and that's really a good thing, because, I mean, networks have voluntarily, you know, agreed to do some of those kinds of things. There's been a lot of information indicating that young children can't separate the difference between a program and an advertisement, especially when a lot of your children's advertisements are animated. So, you know, they see their little cartoon characters, and then all of a sudden there's these little cartoon characters selling Captain Crunch cereal. And for a lot of young kids, they can't conceptually make the distinction, you know, between this thing here is trying to persuade you to buy a cereal. This thing here is for you to sit back and enjoy watching your, you know, your cartoon character friends, sort of thing. Well, one of the studies that's been done, there actually has been a lot of things done. How can we change that and make children more aware of the persuasive intent of advertisement? You know, make them less vulnerable to that kind of persuasion. And one great study that was done, and it was really as simple as taking a group of children, and again, you have a control group here, taking a group of children and just sitting down with them for like, it was either 20 or 40 minutes, I think, and explaining to them the purpose of advertising. Because a lot of kids don't even understand what advertising is. They think it's somebody out there trying to do you a favor, saying, you know, this is the cereal you should get, oh gee, thank you, without realizing there's this profit-motivated kind of thing. They're trying to persuade you to buy products so they can make money, these kinds of things. And they don't go into the profit-motivated thing as much. But with one group of kids, they just spend a certain amount of time teaching them what advertising is. Basically, this is a technique called forewarning. We'll talk about this for anybody that has the persuasion class next semester or here already had it. You may remember that. Forewarning is where you give people advance notice of an attempt to persuade them. And research has shown on adults that increases resistance to persuasion, that anytime people know that this message that they're going to be exposed to is an attempt to persuade, not to inform, that increases their resistance and they tend to be less persuaded. So basically you're applying the forewarning kind of, at least a variation of it, to children. So these kids here were given the forewarning information. This is what advertising is out to do. They're not out to do you a favor. They're trying to make, you know, get you to buy this particular product. This group of kids did not have that training. And then they exposed the kids to the advertisements, and then after the fact, they found a notable significant difference, that the children that had the forewarning explanation of the, you know, what advertising is, they were much less resistant or much less vulnerable to the persuasion, more resistant. They were not as influenced, not as susceptible to the persuasive messages as the kids were, you know, that did not have that forewarning. And that's just a real kind of practical, kind of good application of the study, because it doesn't mean that you have to have some formal thing of people, you know, forewarning kids. It means that parents can just sit down with your kids and just explain to them a couple of times when they're watching TV the difference between what a commercial is and what the program is and what advertising is really trying to do. And, you know, you can easily increase the child's resistance to that kind of susceptibility and that kind of vulnerability. So, you know, I think both our listening study and that children's advertising study are excellent, you know, classical sorts of examples of this post-test only design. Just like with the pre-test, post-test control group, we also have a comparison group. You can do the exact same thing here, you know, where instead of having a control group, you could have a post-test only comparison group where, you know, you have one group exposed to one variation of the variable and another group exposed to another variation of the variable. And just for, you know, this might be good for continuity, a couple of the examples that we've already used in class during the first part of the semester when we were doing things like recognizing independent and dependent variables and some of the research questions, samples, and stuff like that. One of the examples that I used, and I think this was even an example on your first exam, where you're talking about comparing how much people are influenced from television ads compared to something like print ads or radio ads. Well, that would be a classic example of this. You don't have a control group. You have two different treatments. These people are exposed to the television advertisement. These people are exposed to the print advertisement. And you could even envision an X3 here. These people are exposed to the television ad, these people are exposed to the print ad, these people are exposed to the radio ad. Another example I think I probably used was color advertisement versus black and white advertisement. These people have the color ad, these people have the black and white ad, and then you're just comparing to see, you know, was there a difference there in terms of which groups were more persuaded or, you know, more, you know, believed the advertisement more, that kind of thing. Another classic example, and again, this is a real good practical application. Again, I think I mentioned this as another type of example on Tuesday. There's so much effort in terms of trying to perfect our public service messages and campaigns towards younger subjects, you know, young kids, trying to do things like keep them from drinking, keep them from smoking, keep them from doing drugs, these kinds of things. Well, that's not just a hit and miss kind of thing. I mean, there's a lot of effort that groups put in to trying to find out what are the most effective kinds of messages that we can get out there to really keep kids from doing these, you know, self-destructive kinds of behaviors. You know, I mean, obviously as adults, people do some of these things, but, you know, for the young group of kids. And so you have a lot of kinds of research, you know, you can envision where you're doing this, where you're taking two different types of public service messages that are anti-drug oriented and trying to compare then to the kids which one's more believable, which one is more credible, which one is more likely to make you say no to drugs, those kinds of things. Even though this wasn't really, this in the strict sense, this actually, I've already started the example, so let me finish it, and then I'll refer back to it when we get to our quasi-experiment. Even though this example I'm about to mention wouldn't really be a full experiment because we didn't really have randomized distribution of subjects, in one of my persuasion classes a while back, a group as part of a project actually went into a middle school. Well, they worked with the local TV6 new television station, and they got a whole list of, or a whole sample of different anti-drug public service messages, and then they made arrangements with, you know, a middle school, at least one, I'm not sure if they used more than one or not, where they could get a bunch of these middle school kids together and show them a series of these anti-drug commercials, and then they talked to the kids. I mean, this was an interview kind of thing. It wasn't like a questionnaire, but it was still an observation. And then they talked to the kids, trying to get information as to which of these ads or which of these public service messages did you find more believable, which were more credible, which were more likely to make you afraid to do drugs. Now, it wasn't really the randomized distribution probability sampling. It was a good example of convenience sampling. They went into one middle school that we happen to have locally. They, you know, conveniently accessed these group of kids, and they had to get parental permission to do it. So it wasn't like they could just really randomly, you know, do probability sampling. It was more convenience kind of sampling. And they wouldn't have just had X1 and X2, because I think they used at least 6 different PSAs. And they found some notable differences in terms of which ones kids found more credible and more believable, and which ones they didn't. You've got what you need for here, which is the design of the study, but if any of you are curious about what the results of it were, the ones that tended to be the most effective are the ones that had other kids talking about their personal experiences, instead of just some middle-aged, conservative-looking authority figure saying, do not do drugs. You know, they found the ones that were the most effective was a 13-year-old talking about what happened to his brother or his best friend who was driving drunk, or, you know, who was doing drugs. And for the 13-year-old, I think it was an example of, you know, being drunk, that kind of thing. Those were the ones that were the most effective. The ones that were the least effective were the ones that were just a simple scare tactic. Haven't some of you seen that one with the cast iron skillet, where they say, this is your brain, this is drug, this is your brain on drug? Now, the older version of that, the skillet was on the stove and they crack an egg and then it sizzles and it says, this is your brain on drugs. And a more recent version of that is this girl that I think took heroin or something. Yeah, she just starts going wild, right? You know, banging things around and stuff like that. That's the kind of ad that the kids found least effective and least believable. They saw right through it. They saw that as just a scare tactic, even though it's true, you know. I mean, obviously, some young kids certainly shouldn't be doing heroin, you know, but they found that, you know, very uncredible, and they found it less believable. So there's some really good kind of practical applications of that. Oh, okay. One other example, and I'm reflecting a while back here, but a former acquaintance that I had that was working on her PhD, this is a while back, at Kent State University, and one of the things that she was specializing in was eating disorders. And it seems to me that one of the people she was working with had done some research where they were comparing different types of public service messages geared primarily towards adolescent females, trying to prevent them from engaging in eating disorders. And it was you would think this would be a real simple thing, but the two kind of things they were comparing here is the message that just warns them about the evils of eating disorders, like anorexia and bulimia, and another variation was a message that, in addition to just warning them about the dangers of eating disorders, also included information about how you can manage and control your weight. And so, you can kind of see the likelihood, and if I recall correctly, the second one really was potentially more effective, that instead of just telling these young females, don't do these things, you don't address the issue of why they're doing them, which is trying to maintain some kind of usually unrealistic body image. Whereas in the other condition, you say, don't do these things, and if you're really concerned about your weight, here's some other ways of reducing your weight, rather than, starving yourself, or, those kinds of things. And so there's some very, very, very important, realistic kinds of applications of these sorts of things. But there again, when you think of both of those kinds of examples, a pretest wouldn't even conceptually make sense there. You're trying to see how effective is this ad compared to this ad, and so doing a pretest kind of design wouldn't really make sense. So a lot of times you do the post-test only design because you either want to avoid the possibility of pretest sensitization, or in some of these examples, a pretest doesn't even conceptually make sense. It wouldn't fit in there. So again, you have the same kind of thing. Your comparison group is where you're comparing two different treatments, two different treatment groups. The control group, one group's the treatment group, one group is the control group. Questions or anything? Okay. Okay, with that then we go to a whole another type of design, even though the first type of this type is essentially something that you already know and understand based on what we've already done. And our next type are what's referred to as quasi-experiments. And now one type of quasi-experiment is the exact model of one of our types of full experiments, except it doesn't have the probability sampling. But there are some other types of quasi-experiments as well. Why are they called quasi-experiments? One of the reasons they're called quasi-experiments is because they do not use probability sampling. And so that right away, can make the distinction between a quasi-experiment and a full experiment. A full experiment, by definition, uses probability sampling. Quasi-experiments do not. Another difference with the quasi-experiment, at least with some of them, you don't have as much control over the situation, and you don't have as much control over the, the conditions of the study. Now, this isn't quite so much in the first one that we give, but when we give a couple of the other ones, you'll see, you can see from our examples of full experiments, whether it's the pre-test, post-test, or the post-test only, you're obviously envisioning some kind of situation where the researchers are in very high control of everything. I mean, not just the sampling procedures being probability sampling, but also in terms of the exposure to the variables. They're manipulating them. We have this variable, we have this version of it, we have this version of it. It's all very highly controlled. Some of your quasi-experiments, you don't have that kind of control over the situation. You might even be looking at naturally occurring variables, but you're just sort of comparing people's exposure to things and stuff like this. So there's a variety of differences, but one difference with quasi-experiments is, especially if they're modeling that pre-test, post-test, or post-test only, they're not using probability sampling. Another one is, in a lot of the quasi-experiments, you don't have as much control over the situation as you do with a full experiment. That doesn't mean that they're not good, though, because there's a lot of things that you do as researchers to try to still make the results as reliable and valid as you can. So quasi-experiment doesn't have to mean it's not valid, or it doesn't have to mean there is no good internal validity. They can still be highly reliable and highly valid. So by saying it's a quasi-experiment doesn't mean it's only quasi-reliable or quasi-valid. It just means that's the label of the kind of experiment, but it can still be just as reliable and just as valid. Well, one person, you know, somebody might ask themselves, well, why even do a quasi-experiment instead of a full experiment? And again, there's a lot of situations that just aren't conducive to studying something in a full experiment. And so given a choice between not being able to study this at all or studying it in some other alternative way, obviously it's better to study it somehow and just try to do it as reliably and validly as you can, rather than just say, well, gee, you know, we're not even going to ask those kinds of questions. Well, this type we can easily zip to, and the quasi-experiment, and this is our exact duplicate of what our full experiments were, except without the probability sampling. One would be, you know, your pre-test, post-test, except here, there's just a slight difference in the title. You've got your pre-test, post-test, non-equivalent. And again, it could be either control group or comparison group design. By saying non-equivalent, it doesn't mean that your groups aren't going to be equal or well matched. It just means that you can't guarantee it on the basis of your sampling because you're not using probability sampling. So the model is exactly the same. If you're doing the pre-test, post-test control group, it's still, you know, you've got your observation, you've got your variable, then you've got your observation afterwards, you've got your control group. So basically, you know, you've got the same exact kind of thing here, except you don't have the probability sampling. So again, a lot of your objectives and a lot of your purposes and even a lot of the same examples would be here as we talked about with the pre-test, post-test control group, except you can't guarantee equivalency of groups because you're not using randomized subjects. So you can see the importance of one particular comparison here. Obviously, we're still going to compare O2 and O4 in order to see what the effect of the variable is. What are we going to compare to see how equivalent the groups are?
Nothing, because of what you said, we couldn't compare equivalence, because it's not randomized.
It's not probability sampling, but what would we do here to try to say, even though we had the non-equivalent design, the groups were equal? Yeah, excellent. Yeah, good. Compare O1 and O3. Now, we actually talked about that in terms of a check, you know, with the full experiment. Here is where that becomes a really important concept, because since you don't have probability sampling, this comparison of O1 and O3 is the only way that you can say, you can lay any claim at all that our groups were equal. So let's go back to our sampling techniques. Let's say somebody uses convenient sampling, okay? This group is conveniently available, you know, because it happens to be a communication class, and we all have access in our department to communication classes. So we take a few different communication classes or 2 different communication classes. Well, obviously we can't claim any kind of probability sampling there. We can still do the same kind of design, and if we find out that comparing SP250 subjects with SP310 subjects, except that wouldn't be a good example here because so many people are in both classes, you know, but let's say 2 different upper division classes or something like that, your O1 and your O3 is what will give you the claim, even though it's a non-equivalent design, the groups were equal. At least they were equal on the dimension that we were measuring and assessing. Now that probably becomes an important point to emphasize. When you're talking about the equivalency of groups, they don't have to be equivalent in every single possible way. You know, that's kind of unrealistic. All that they need to be is equivalent on the variable that's being measured, right? So if you're comparing, say, an attitude change before a message, after a message, it doesn't really matter how many differences there are in your 2 groups, as long as they're equivalent in terms of what their attitude is on that issue. So they don't have to be equivalent in every dimension and every demographic category. They only have to be equivalent in the particular variable or the particular thing that's being measured. So that's where O1 and O3 would become really critically important, because you have to do that really to say, even though it's a non-equivalent design, the groups were equal in this particular dimension. And you could imagine that. I mean, let's say that we took SP401 and SP495, 2 classes next semester. There's probably no realistic reason to think that The people in SP 401 are gonna have different attitudes about the environment than the people in SP 495 would, you know, but we would want to verify that by giving them an attitude assessment on their environmental issues and environmental attitudes before we actually, you know, would do the experiment. So there's a lot of times that you can still do this design, use convenient sampling, and as long as these two come out okay, you know, you're on safe ground. And our variations would be the same as well. You know, this is the control group design. If you simply substitute, you know, an X2, then you're doing the comparison group. It's exactly the same as we were talking about with the full experiment. But again, you know, of course, the difference is you just don't have the randomized distribution or the probability sampling. So by saying they're non-equivalent, it doesn't mean they're going to be non-equivalent. It just means that your sampling technique doesn't guarantee equivalence. They can still end up being equivalent, and you can prove that they're equivalent by the pretest. Now you can see a bigger problem with this. You could also have, just like we were talking about with the other one, you could also have a post-test only non-equivalent. But there you've got a bigger problem, because if you have a post-test only non-equivalent group, where's your information about how equal or how equivalent the groups are? So this one is much more likely to occur in a study than this one would, because here you don't have probability sampling, so you have no probability way of saying the groups should be equal. You have no pretest, so you have no check to see if the groups are equal or the groups aren't equal. So this is one that, you know, I mean, we're not even going to letter it and everything here. This is the reason why this one would not be very common. It doesn't mean it's not done, but this would be the reason why this would not be very common, because you have nothing to say that your groups are equal. You have no pretest that you could verify it, even though it's not a probability sampling, and you don't have probability sampling. So this would be very skeptical here and very unlikely because of the probability that the groups would not be equal and you have no control over that. You see the difference in terms of why that one's okay for the full experiment, but not okay for the quasi-experiment? Because in the full experiment, post-test only, you might not have a pretest that you can compare your groups, but if you've got probability sampling, that's your claim to equivalency. So you don't have, that's why it's okay for a full experiment, but you don't have that with the quasi-experiment. Questions on this? Yeah, it doesn't have the probability sampling, exactly. At least for this example, it doesn't have probability sampling, yeah. Another kind of quasi-experiment, and this isn't so much related to the sampling, but this is the kind that you can see you just don't have as much control overall over the situation, and that's repeated measures design. Now, again, I had mentioned this on Tuesday. Keep in mind that these aren't every possible instantiation of these models. I'm just kind of keying in on some of the main ones, some of the more common ones, but there's many variations on the theme, and when we get to a couple of them later, I'm even going to, you know, give you what some possible variations would be. So, a repeated measure design, or repeated measures design. And what a repeated measures design is, it's basically looking at a change over time. It's a time series comparison. Now, if I remember, there's a variation on this that I'll mention, but let me just kind of stick with the kind of prototype here as well. One thing that's off the bat different with the repeated measures design is, at least in this first example, you're looking at people that are the same subjects. Now, you could have different subjects as well, but a repeated measures design would be something like 01, 02, 03, X1, 04, 05, 06. So, I mean, again, and it doesn't have to just be 6. I mean, it could be 01, 02, 04, 05. It could be 01, 02, 03, 04, 05, 06, 07, 08. Okay, so it doesn't have to just be 6 observations. The repeated measure just means that you're making multiple observations. Now, this one right here, we're dealing with multiple observations of the same group. But what you're looking for here is changes over time. Well, why have so many different observations? Why not just have an observation, then the variable, and then an observation afterwards? Well, the reason for that is, since you're looking for changes over time, time in and of itself can create a change in some things. One thing that, you know, comes to mind right away is if you're looking at something like organizational training, trying to train a group to perform more productively in an organization. Well, doesn't it just make sense that as time goes on, you're gonna get better and you're gonna get more productive just because you're getting more experience, more experience, and you're learning more. So one kind of application of the repeated measures design, the reason why you would do it this way, you'd have multiple observations before the variable and then multiple observations after the variable, is because you're trying to account for the variable of time itself, or you're trying to exclude time as an alternative explanation. And so here would be the organizational training to increase productivity. So what we would do is we would look at comparisons of their productivity at each of these stages, and then they're given the training, and then we would look at their productivity at these stages, and what we would expect to see would be the biggest jump where? Before I would say it. What two observations would we expect to see the biggest change? 03 and 04, right? Wouldn't that make sense? Because these observations are just showing the difference in time. These observations are showing just a difference in time. First month, second month, third month on the job, fourth month, fifth month, sixth month on the job. Where you're trying to prove the difference is our organizational training was effective. It increased productivity, not just because people had one more month of experience on the work, on the job, but because of the training. And we would expect 03 and 04 here to have your biggest change. So really you'd be comparing the differences. If you find a little or no change in 1, 2, and 3, and little or no change in 4, 5, and 6, but a big change in 3 and 4, that's what gives you the strength to say, look at how effective our organizational training is. Look at how much productivity increased in this month that we gave them the training. And somebody comes back and they say, well, yeah, but they just got a month more experience. And you say, no, 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 because then you would see those differences here as well. And so that's the reason for doing this, doing it before and doing it afterwards. Organizational training is another good one. Another good example that I was going to mention is some kind of public policy, if you have a public policy change, you might look at something like, here's a good example. Let's say that there was some kind of local public policy that made recycling easier, or let's say they did something where you got some monetary incentive to recycle. In terms of, getting not just money back when you take your cans back to the grocery store, but even things that you don't get deposits on, where there was some kind of incentive, or even just a public awareness kind of thing. Well, this would be a good example here as well, where you're kind of tracking what people's recycling behaviors are, and then you have the public policy or the educational campaign or, the public service campaign or whatever you're doing here, and then you're tracking the recycling behaviors after that as well. And again, you can think of many other kinds of examples of public programs or public policies that would be real good here. Another tremendous good example would be a change in some kind of educational policy in public schools, where you're doing things like looking at the literacy rates of kids, and you've got some kind of program here that's supposed to increase the literacy of children, increase their reading comprehension, these kinds of things. Well, obviously, just as kids get a little further along in school, they're going to become better readers and they're going to become, more literate, we would certainly hope. So, you can't just say, 01, X1, 02, because the difference in 01 and 02, if you have the X in the middle, might not have anything to do with your new literacy program. It might just be that it's been a couple of months and so they naturally learn more. But if you track it this way, here's the student's progress month by month before the literacy training program. Now we give them the literacy training program, and now here's their progress month by month afterwards. You would expect that you'd have a big jump in reading comprehension. And that's actually a really good example too. Give kids reading comprehension tests. Give them one, give them another, a month after each other. Give them a literacy training program, then give them reading comprehension tests a month and a month and a month after that as well. And if you find a big difference, a big jump here in 03 and 04, that's pretty good proof that your literacy training program is good.
Would that work if you have like a specific goal that you need to get to. So, for example, like I work in retail, and we're supposed to generate like an increase in a profit for a particular portion of our store. So like I made up a new like conceptualization to do that. So like we already have our stats from like the previous 3 months, and then would that work like, and then you do the previous or like the next 3 months afterwards?
Absolutely. Great example. Whatever the thing is that you're doing, what is it that you're doing there?
Well, we have like a misses section, like a 1424 size, so we need to increase profit. So I've been like redoing the mannequins and redoing the entire section and stuff.
Yeah, that's a good example right there. Your 3 months of the sales records the 3 months before, you redesign the department and all these things that you're trying to do to increase the profits, and then what are your following 3 months' profits? And there again, you could see different ways of analyzing your data. You could do the month-by-month thing, or you could just combine them and say, here's what our 3 months were beforehand, here's what our 3 months were afterwards, but you would still want to look to be sure that the difference between before and after was more than the difference between any individual month, that kind of thing. That's a really, really, really good example. So, see the idea of repeated measures, same group. Now, here again, you know, and I'm glad you bring this up, Hannah, you can see a variation on the theme right here, because what you explained, it wouldn't be the same group, because you can't really say it's the same shoppers coming in every month. It's obviously different people. It's the same store that you're, in the same department that you're looking at, so that's the same, but you can't say it's always the same shoppers. So that's a variation, but it's still a repeated measures design, you know, in the same, you know, in the exact same kind of structure, and the exact same kind of idea. Another kind of variation on the repeated measures design, and this is where it's still repeated measures, but it's where you would have different groups. You're actually using a comparison group. I guess I didn't have to erase that. You have the exact same kind of thing. You have, let's say, 01, 02, 03, X1, 04, 05, 06, and then we have a control group under here. And we're doing a repeated measures, but instead of just doing a repeated measures on one group of people, we're doing a repeated measures comparing 2 different groups of people. And again, you're trying to account for the time, you know, you're trying to account for the time difference between, and that's why you would still want those examples. One, you know, obvious kind of example here would be, let's say something like how much knowledge people have about the presidential campaign, and whether they watch the debates or whether they don't watch the debates. This would be a classic kind of model for that, because you can't just say who watched the debates and who didn't watch the debates and how much knowledge is there, because you know, there's going to be an effect of time in and of itself. As each month of the campaign goes by, you would, or even each week of the campaign goes by, you would expect that people would learn a little more just because there's been more campaigning going on. So that would be a really good example of doing this kind of design, where you're tracking how much information people have in the month or the weeks before the debates. This group of people watched the debates, this group of people didn't watch the debates, and then you're looking at how much information they have after the fact as well. And there again, you could envision a couple of different kinds of things. You would still expect your biggest difference to be, you know, your 03s and your 04s. How much knowledge did you have before the debate? How much knowledge did you have after the debate? But in that example, there would even be some worthwhile comparisons of the 04, the 05s, and the 06s. And the thing that is at least going through my mind right now is, when you watch the presidential debates, it might not just give you more information right there, it could motivate you to get more information and consume more information after the debates as well. And again, we do this more in the persuasion class, but tons of research, a lot of research has shown that the most important contribution that presidential debates make for people, the voter, it doesn't change your mind most of the time. We talked about that. Relatively few people change their mind. One of the main important things about the debates is that it increases voter involvement. So to verify that, you would also expect a change here, wouldn't you? It's not just how much did you know immediately after the debate, but if this amount increases more, as then this amount increases, that doesn't mean that you just learn more from the debates. It means that you got more involved, you got more interested as a result of watching the debates, and you're continuing to consume more information in '04, '05, and '06 than for the people that didn't watch the debates. Am I being clear? Do you see what I mean? In terms of, not just what all three of these would be together, but you would expect this '04 and '05, you know, even, let's say, even after the '04, you would expect a greater jump between '04 and '05 and '05 and '06 here than you would expect between '04 and '05 and '05 and '06 here if people were more motivated. Another thing that is shown to be the main importance of presidential debates, at least for the voters, is, again, not that they change their mind about the candidates, but they learn more about the candidates, and they learn more about what the important issues are. And this would be a classic kind of assessment of that. Obviously, you're going to learn a little more about the issues just by the fact that week by week goes by. You know, if you watch any kind of news or read any kind of information online dealing with the credible information, you know, about the debates. But where you would expect to find your biggest difference here is, do people know more about the critical issues after watching the debates compared to people that didn't watch the debates? And actually, in both of these examples, research has shown, now it hasn't always been this exact kind of repeated measures design, but in both of those kinds of examples, research actually has shown the effect that watching debates increases voter involvement, they become more motivated. Also, it shows that they don't learn more, or they don't change their mind about their candidates necessarily, but they do learn more about what the issues are. You know, this is a critical issue, this is a critical issue, this is a critical issue. Now, there's some subtle nuances in terms of some of the things they don't learn, but those are some of the things that they do learn. Now, you could also envision something like, instead of you know, a group that has the variable and a group that doesn't, you could also envision two different kinds of variable, an X1 and an X2 here. A good, sticking with continuity, let's stick with something like the debates. What you might find, well, not the debates, but let's stick with the campaign, is how informed are the voters depending upon which source of news they rely on the most. And again, this is something that's really been researched a lot in terms of how much do you rely on television for your source of campaign news, how much do you rely on newspapers. As surprising as it seems, there's a reasonably high percentage of people that rely on talk shows for their news. And you can see it, the distorted view, but I mean, like a lot of people watch the Daily Show with Jon Stewart, and that's their main source of campaign information. You know, is just what the, you know, what the talk show hosts say, or what the interviewees that they have come on the show, or online information. Now, one of the reasons this has been done, tracking, and again, for any of you that are in the persuasion class, I've got just some excellent data that actually tracks and shows what the proportionate change has been. There's not a big a big X1 and an X2 here, but one of the reasons why this kind of research is done is they're showing that more and more people are relying on online sources for their information, especially the younger demographic voters. You know, your 18 to 29-year-old voters are clearly the highest demographic group in terms of getting your information online compared to, you know, newspapers or evening news or, you know, television shows, that kind of thing. So that would be another good example here. How informed are the voters about the campaign? How much knowledge do they have? And you're comparing different, you know, different sources of information that they use. And you could even envision things like maybe before the debate, after the debate, different networks, you know, same kind of thing. So in either of those examples, you're still dealing with the repeated measures. The reason why you're doing the multiple measures is, the primary reason is you're accounting for the factor of time in and of itself. Where the repeated measures becomes particularly important is if time could be a potential confounding variable. Time itself could create a change. So you want measures before whatever you're studying and measures afterwards, and that way you can account for the idea of time. I won't model this, but just to give you an idea of a variation on a repeated measures design. Most of you, I think, know what agenda setting is. You know, agenda setting is the idea that the news stories that media covers the most and gives the most prominence to influences public attitudes, not what your attitude is about the issue, but about which issues are more important of the day. Basically, that political saliency, what the most important issues of the day are. And there's been some just really creative research done. They've done what's called a time series correlation, where they trace the rise and fall of how much time news agencies cover a story, and then they track the rise and fall of public opinion in terms of what are the most important issues of the day, and then they overlap those two results with each other, and there is a, there actually is a time series correlation, a specific statistical test that shows a significant relationship, and that's a way of empirically proving the agenda setting effect. As the coverage of stories rises and falls, you can see a correlation in terms of public attitudes about what issues are most important, rising and falling right along with it. Now, it doesn't always work that way, but in the cases where they have, with certain issues at least, that's a great way of proving empirically, here's evidence of agenda setting effect. So that's a variation on the repeated measures. It's just you've got two different variables. You're studying the repeated measure of the rise and fall of coverage and the repeated measure of the rise and fall of public attitudes on political saliency, and you're correlating them together. Now, you don't have the X1, XO in there. There isn't a variable manipulation that's different. You're just tracking the difference in time between those two different variables over the course of a certain period of time. So again, there would be some good kinds of examples of our repeated measures designs. Questions or anything on that? There are other potential examples of quasi-experiments, but those are just two that I wanted to mention. One of them is the same group. The other one, you're comparing groups. Just like with our other examples, when you're doing the comparing, it could be a control group. One group watches the debates, the other group doesn't watch the debates. Or it could be a comparison group. One group gets their information online, the other group gets their information from television, that kind of thing. So, again, many different kind of variations there. Another type of experimental design is referred to as a pre-experiment. And a pre-experiment or a pre-experimental design has the least control over your situation, and you'll see why when we get into some of the examples. But again, that doesn't mean it's bad. It doesn't mean that it's not necessarily a good idea. One of the benefits of a pre-experiment, and again, you'll see these from some of the examples, there's some things that there's just no way that you could possibly study by either a full experiment or a quasi-experiment. There's some things that the only way you can study these things is by some kind of pre-experimental design. And again, faced with the choice of, do we not even study all this really fascinating stuff, or do we have a variation in terms of how we would study it? Again, at least I want to kind of go through three different types of pre-experiments. One type of pre-experiment, and this one is just very, very, very common, and I know that you've come across a lot of information without them using this name that have really been this particular kind of pre-experimental design, and that's a static group comparison. With a static group comparison, you're taking, now again, you don't have any kind of probability sampling or anything like that. A static group comparison is where the variable has already happened. It's nothing that you controlled, it's nothing that you manipulated. It's already occurred. So you take people that have been exposed to this variable compared to people that have not been exposed to that variable, or people that have been exposed to one aspect of the variable and people that have been exposed to the other aspect of the variable, and you compare them. So again, you can envision our two different models here. You've got, and this is diagrammed just a little different in terms of like having the line on it. Same thing. I mean, you understand the XO compared to a number by this time, right? O means no exposure. 1 means exposure. So here you have treatment control. X1, X2 means two different exposures. The example that every single one of you are familiar with, tons of research, even though you've seen the results of it, I don't know if you've actually gone and looked at the studies. Look at all of the health studies that have been done on people that have been exposed to some kind of toxic chemical compared to people that haven't been exposed to this toxic chemical. There's no way you could do that experimentally. I mean, what does that mean? We're going to take the people in Manistee and put toxic mercury in their drinking water, and then take Marquette and not put toxic mercury in our drinking water, and then see how many people get diseases in Manistee compared to Marquette? There's no way that you could do that. So what you do with this kind of design, this is really how almost all of the exposure studies are done. You take people that have been exposed to the chemicals, you compare them with people that have not been exposed to the chemicals, and you see if there's a difference in their health effects. This kind of research has even been done with things like power lines. You know, some of you have probably come across some of the information that certain types of power lines, people that live near power, some of these power lines can create things like birth defects. And so they take people that live in some of these areas, compare the frequency or the ratio of birth defects with people that don't live in those areas. This is how most all your smoking studies are done, right? You don't get a group of people that don't smoke and say, smoke all these cigarettes for the next 8 months, and then we're going to see how much worse your lungs are than the group that's not smoking cigarettes. You take people that don't smoke, and you compare them with people that do smoke, and you see what's the ratio of cardiovascular issues or lung problems, respiratory problems, these kinds of things. Now, even though that's how, you can obviously see why those kind of studies have to be done that way, because again, you can't expose people to harmful things. This kind of stuff has been done as well with military. For example, for veterans that came back from Vietnam, one of the big things was their exposure to Agent Orange, which is a chemical that was being used as basically as a weapon. And they compared veterans that were around the Agent Orange chemical weapon and veterans that were not, and found some very notable, kind of differences, those kinds of things. That doesn't always mean that your results are right, because obviously you could have things about your two groups that are different. But that's the only way you could study it. You can't study it any other way. One example that comes to my mind in terms of the how the groups could be different, when the Surgeon General, you don't know when this happened, but this happened. The reason we have all the warning labels on cigarettes and everything like that is it was a result of a very extensive study that the Surgeon General of the United States did that conclusively proved cigarette smoking was a harm. And of course, we found out that the tobacco companies kind of knew that anyway. But as a result of the Surgeon General's study, that's why there's all these warnings on cigarettes, these warning labels on cigarettes. Well, he also studied at the same time pipe smokers. And interestingly, one of the reasons that you don't find any, being somebody that smokes a pipe, I'm really happy to see this, you don't have any kind of warning labels on pipe tobacco at all, or you don't have to by law. And it's because the result of the Surgeon General's report, not only, now this is where the groups have to be different, not only did the Surgeon General's study not find worse health in the pipe smokers compared to the non-smokers, actually found a lower rate of mortality among the pipe smokers compared to people that didn't smoke at all. Now, on the surface, that would mean like everybody starts smoking a pipe and you're going to live longer. But obviously you can, if you're thinking to yourself what could explain the results, your only logical conclusion is there must be something different about pipe smokers as a demographic group that could explain that lower mortality. It's not because they smoke. Yeah, maybe the pipe smokers have longer lifespans than the non-smokers, but that doesn't mean it's because of the pipe. And at least one of the ideas that comes to my mind is the fact that a pipe smoker smokes a pipe instead of cigarettes probably indicates some health consciousness in general. So maybe they have better diets, maybe they're less stressful, maybe they drink less alcohol. The fact that they're smoking and smoke a pipe instead of cigarettes, that might mean they have other behaviors that are more health conscious than the average person is, and that's obviously what explains the longer mortality. It's not start smoking a pipe and you're going to live longer. So this is a really good kind of design, but your biggest issue here in terms of the external validity of the study as well as the internal validity of the study is, are the two groups really comparable? And that becomes something that has to be argued. And that's why these kinds of things, would be studied again and again, several different kinds of times. Let me give you a couple of other examples that have to be studied by this design. I just came across a study, this is just recent, this was just seemed like just within the last couple of weeks or so, that was comparing the emotional development of young children as to whether they used pacifiers, their parents gave them pacifiers when they were infants, or whether they didn't give them pacifiers. And I don't know why, but it seems to me that for some reason they only studied little boys, or maybe it was just little boys are the only ones that showed the effect. But they actually showed results, that the little boys that were not weaned on pacifiers showed more emotional development, higher levels of emotional development at those young ages, like by age 3, 4, 5, that kind of thing, than the little boys that were given pacifiers that showed a higher level of emotional development. Now there again, you can see there could be some differences, not so much in the kids themselves, but there could be some differences in the parents, right? A parent that doesn't give their kid a pacifier, there might be all other kinds of things that the parent does that is the reason for the child being more emotionally developed, and it might not be the pacifier. So you always have to kind of ask that question, is there anything about these two things that can account for the difference besides the thing you're comparing? On the surface, it looks like using pacifiers are not a good idea because it slows down the emotional development of the child. That doesn't mean that the children are emotionally disabled. It just means that they didn't emotionally develop as quick as the other children did. They still emotionally develop. It's just they don't emotionally develop as early. So on the surface, it looks like your child will emotionally develop quicker if you don't use the pacifier than if you do use the pacifier. But again, you could probably envision a whole bunch of things. Since using a pacifier is such a normal kind of traditional thing to do, for parents that don't use a pacifier, that's probably not the only non-traditional thing they do. There's probably a whole variety of things that they do different in raising their kids. And that could be the explanation, or those could be the explanations for why the young boys were more emotionally developed, you know, at 3, 4, 5 years old, that kind of thing. Another good example that, I won't give you too many, but I guess you could think of this either way, but given what the study is focusing on, it's more like this. There's been research done comparing divorce rates with whether two people lived together before they were married or didn't live together before they were married. Did they cohabitate or not cohabitate before they were married? And it actually shows, the results actually show that there is a higher correlation for divorce among the people that did cohabitate before they were married compared to the people that didn't cohabitate. Now, you can see, you can't say causality. I mean, it doesn't mean if you live together before you get married, it means you have a better chance of getting a divorce. What would be a likely logical explanation? I mean, the data is really clear, though, that there's a higher divorce rate among couples that cohabitate before marriage compared to couples that don't cohabitate before marriage. What else could explain that result aside from just, did you live together or not? What'd you say? What about value? That's the big one. Say more.
I mean, maybe if they don't live together before marriage,
Somebody want to pick it up for her? You're absolutely right.
Is it because maybe it shows that you're not completely committed, you're kind of testing the waters first if you live with them before you marry them, but like if you know it's for sure, then you don't have to live with them before you get married, you just jump right on in?
Okay, they're just as a separate thing that Delaney thought of the rest of her answer. But let me come back to Stephanie's. That's a separate explanation that could possibly explain it, right? Maybe the people that cohabitate are less certain, and they have less trust in the institution than the people that, you know, don't cohabitate. That could be an explanation.
I'm thinking more like religiously, people who don't live together,
I don't believe in divorce.
Yeah,
they're more likely to
Like if
get out.
you don't live, like if you're religious, you're not gonna live together before you're married, but then you're also like, if you get, I feel like I'm stereotyping, but you know what I mean, I bend the cross. Like if you're, stereotypically, if you're religious, you're not gonna live together before you're married, and then you're also you're less likely to get a divorce because that's like the Bible says so.
Yeah, and let me just make a slight variation on what both of you are saying. It might not just be religious values, although that would certainly be a biggie there. The way some people would characterize it is more traditional values, okay? The traditional value, you don't live together until you're married. So doesn't it logically make sense that for people that have more traditional values, that you're not supposed to live together until you get married, also have the more traditional value that marriage is for life, and once you're in, and they're less likely to go into a divorce. Now that obviously links to the religious values as well, because there are some religions, for example, that really actively discourage divorce. Now I think the Catholic Church has really lightened up a little bit compared to what they used to be. But used to be, I'm Catholic myself, used to be the Catholic Church, you were out of the church if you got divorced. You had to basically, you know, give up your church. But Lauren, you're nodding. Are you Catholic?
Well, yeah, my family's Catholic, and my parents got divorced, and so like that's funny that you said it's a Catholic church. church has lightened up a little bit.
Haven't they?
Mhm.
I mean, you can still be a member of the church, right?
Yeah, like
Okay.
20 years ago, you wouldn't have been able to go to, well, you could have gone to church, but you couldn't have, like, received the Eucharist if you gotten divorced, but now, like, it's kind of less of a big deal.
And I think it used to be too, and I think this has changed, is you couldn't even get married in a Catholic church if you had
Right.
been married before.
Yeah, that's
And
true.
that's changed too, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, so, you're right though, in terms of the traditional kind of values, that could explain that cohabitation, not cohabitation kind of thing. So, you see the benefit of the static group comparison? You see the trade-off, right? Look at all of the things that you couldn't study otherwise. Exposure to toxic chemicals, the harms of smoking, cohabitation and divorce, emotional development of children. So, I mean, this is a bunch of stuff that we really need to study, and this is the way that we can do it. On the other hand, you do have that validity and reliability issue. Is there something about the two groups other than the variable you're looking at that could explain the results? So this really is something that, you just have to kind of intellectually and logically argue, so you can see the limitations to this research, but you can also see the tremendous positive benefits to that research as well.
And within this research, you say the variable already occurred, meaning like before they stepped into like your research or whatever, the variable always happened, and you're just picking from those two groups, and you're not implementing the variable, you're just comparing.
Absolutely. These are people that smoke, didn't smoke, you don't make them smoke.
Right.
These are people that lived together beforehand or didn't live together beforehand. You don't pick people and say, you guys live together, you guys don't live together. These are kids that used a pacifier, these are kids that didn't use a pacifier. You don't tell some parents, make your kid use a pacifier, and tell other parents, don't use a pacifier.
Okay.
Yes. And you can see the same idea here, right? The same idea here. It's still a static group comparison. It's just, instead of you had some exposure, or you did something compared to you didn't, here's where you would look at two different kinds of things. Classic example, a lot of research out there that is aimed at, well, it doesn't always have to be proprietary research, aimed at supporting private education compared to public education in your primary and secondary years, but there's a lot of research out there that compares the college grade point average of people that went to private schools in like high school and middle school and that kind of thing, compared to people that went to public schools. And the results are very, very, very conclusive that the people that go to private schools have a much higher literacy rate, they have a much higher college GPA on the average compared to kids that go to public schools. And this is a constant kind of struggle with public schools, is how can they improve the quality of their education to bring it up, not just bring it up in general, but to bring it up where it's equivalent to a private school. And for those of you that keep up with some of this as a political issue, from sometimes campaign to campaign, the big issue in terms of things like vouchers, where you can give parents some vouchers so they can send their kids to a private school instead of a public school, so you're not economically at least one reason, so you're not economically discriminating, that only the wealthier people can send their kids to private schools, trying to equalize that a little bit. But obviously you can see the competition, because public schools want to increase the quality of their education, so private schools no longer have that competitive advantage.
Is that the same for college level or secondary education, or is that just for like?
You mean like private college compared to
versus
public
like
college?
a state school?
They do some of those kinds of studies, and you do find that in most of your private institutions, I'm pretty sure there is a higher level of achievement. Why that becomes less of a valid comparison is because your private institutions usually have such higher quality admission standards. So yeah, your people that go to Harvard probably are on the average, higher in terms of some of their scores than somebody that goes to, gosh, don't take any offense here, somebody that went to Grand Valley State. Anybody go to Grand Valley State? Okay, no offense to Grand Valley State at all. But obviously that's not comparable, because you have to be a much better student to get into Harvard than you do to get into Grand Valley State. So that's why it wouldn't be as comparable if you're doing colleges, because the admission standards are different. Yeah. This is also the basis for, again, here's one of the areas that you've just come across tons of this research, all the gender comparisons and communication styles, in terms of like where we were just talking, even though I didn't go into a lot of the detail, but in 310 last night, and certainly we make a big deal about this in the 110 class, all the studies that have been done on male and female nonverbal behavior, showing that females smile more, they have more touch, they have more closer space, in communication than males do. And it's not all males or all females, but there's just been many, I mean literally hundreds of studies that have been done comparing male and female nonverbal behaviors. And that's a classic example of this. You know, you don't make, you say, okay, these people were gonna make female and these people were gonna make male. You're taking males, you're taking females, you're comparing their nonverbal behavior, and then you're concluding the results. Not just in terms of the actual behavior, but even the test scores on something like the PONS test. You know, the PONS is the Profile of Nonverbal Sensitivity, which is an empirical measurement to assess how accurately somebody can recognize people's emotions by their facial expressions and by their vocal cues. And females, you know, typically score significantly higher than males do in terms of their nonverbal awareness of other people's emotions. So, you know, that's the basis for all these different kind of gender studies as well. There are, let's see, one other one that I wanted to mention real quick. Comparison of single-parent, dual-parent families in terms of kids, where they talk about things like the grade point average of kids brought up in a single-parent family compared to the grade point average of kids brought up in a dual-parent family, or the emotional adjustment of a child brought up in a single-parent family compared to a dual-parent family. And that's this kind of study, you know, where you're taking these people, these kids that are in a single-parent family, and these kids that are in a dual-parent family. And as far as I know, there is no significant difference there. I mean, if you've got a good single parent, you can raise your kid, and they're just as smart, and they're just as well developed as, you know, being brought up in a dual-parent family. And if it's a dual-parent family that has problems, your single-parent family kid is actually going to be better. It's better to bring a kid up in a happy environment with one parent than a constant fighting environment with two parents. So there is no difference that you can say in terms of dual-parent families compared to single-parent families, which are the best for the kids. It's all just a matter of the parents. But those studies still have been done, you know, and it's obviously, you know, an important kind of thing that, you know, that we would include. Those are the main kinds of things. Oh, let me give you one other one real quick. Comparing educational programming that kids watch with their performance in school, like young kids. Kids that watch Sesame Street, kids that watch The Electric Company, and then comparing, do the kids that watch Electric Company as a, you know, educational TV show, do they differ in terms of their math abilities than kids that watch Sesame Street, that type of thing. And there has even been some studies, I think, done comparing kids that watch these educational programs, comparing kids that don't watch the educational programs as well. So these are real good. I mean, just think of what that says for the PBS station that carries the programs, or for the programs themselves, to be able to say, kids that watch our PBS educational programs, on the average, have higher math scores than kids that don't watch our programs.
What is the Electric Company?
Oh, you know that? It's like they might not have it anymore. It was an educational program for kids, you know, in terms of teaching them math and spelling and stuff like that. You know the part, you know Sesame Street, right?
Yeah.
You know the part of Sesame Street that focuses on learning?
Yeah.
The Electric Company was a whole show that just focused on learning. You know, you had characters and games and songs and stuff like this, but it was just an educational program to get kids to spell and learn their words and numbers and, you know, those kinds of things.
What's the shenanigans I heard about Robbie trying to get rid of?
Let me just real quick give you a variation or two of our static group comparison. One variation of our static group comparison is where instead of just one observation, you have more than one observation. For example, you would have, instead of 01, 02, you would have 01 and 02 for this group, and you would have 01 and 02 for this group. And it could go further on. This is just a variation. Good example of this, and I use this study actually. I read you know, some summary of the results in my 110 class for an example of this study, even though we're not talking about the methodological design. One of the things that's really fascinating is when you're looking at young infants' language development, in the early stages of life, all infants have equal potential in terms of producing all different phonetic sounds. All the phonetic sounds in all the world's languages, young infants have equal potential to produce those sounds. Well, as they age in the early stage of infancy, they're not just learning more about their language, they're unlearning the ability to produce phonetic sounds that they don't hear in their language. And a classic example of this study they did a, you know, in the Japanese language, they don't have the L phonetic sound. And if you've ever listened to adult Japanese people that have learned English as a second language, they oftentimes have difficulty saying the L sound. Well, as a young baby in their crib, they were going la 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 la, just like any American baby would. But because there's no L phonetic sound in the Japanese language, they lose the ability to say that, and they lose the ability to discriminatively hear the difference between an L and an R sound. So this study right here, they took English, infants in an English environment, infants in a Japanese environment. They studied them at 7 months old, and they found that there was no difference whatsoever in the 7-month-old American baby's ability to make the LR distinction compared to the 7-month-old Japanese baby to make the LR distinction. At 11 months, however, just 4 months later, there was a noticeable difference in both directions. The American infants got better at making the LR distinction. The Japanese infants got worse at making the LR distinction. So it's still a static group comparison, right? These people are American babies, these people are Japanese babies. That's not something that was manipulated. You study them at time 1, which is 7 months, and compare the difference. Then you study them both at time 2, and you compare the difference. And, you know, classic kind of example of that particular kind of study. Give you one other variation here, and this one, without talking about the methodology of the study, I was talking about the results last night in 310. One of the things that is just fascinating in terms of the uniformity of language acquisition, we were talking about this in comm theory, all infants everywhere, regardless of country, regardless of language, they go through the same stages in learning language, and they go through them in the same order and approximately the same age. Can you envision what your static group comparison would be here? One particular study, they studied like 35 different languages around the world and found that all children in all 35 language cultures developed language at the same rate, the same stages, and the same approximate ages. So really what you've got here is you've got ... down to X35, and you've got, you know, O1 ... down to O35, and what you're really doing is you're comparing 35 different languages and the stages that the children go through in acquiring language in each of those 35 languages, and you find that there's no noticeable difference at all. They go through the same stages, the same order, and even the same approximate ages, regardless of their language. So that's basically a static group comparison, but it's where you have 35 different groups that you're comparing instead of just 2. That gives you a couple of potential variations in terms of the static group comparison. Should I not erase this yet?
No, I have a question. Is that supposed to be on and on 2 on both?
Yes, because you're comparing these at the same time. It's not going to be the same way as it was on the experiments, because you're comparing age 7 for both of them, or 7 months, 11 months for both of them. So it's not like 01, 02, 03, 04 here. Another type of our pre-experimental designs is a one-time case study. If we were to diagram our one-time case study, basically it's just X1, O1. You know, it's just that's basically what a case study is. There's some kind of condition, and you study, you know, as a case study, you study that particular situation. Now, a lot of these, you know, you could easily include an alternative condition, but you could still do this one-time case study. Good example of the one-time case study, there's been a lot of research on bringing pets into senior citizens' homes. And they're not going to do a kind of thing where they say, okay, you elderly people get cats, and you elderly people don't get cats. But what they do is, you know, they do things like bring in dogs or bring in cats. Sometimes the animals live there at the senior home. Sometimes they just bring them in for visits, like maybe the local humane society or something like that. Bring in cats or dogs on a given day so that, you know, the elderly people can play with them and stuff like that. And there has been tremendously notable, you know, positive results among the elderly people in terms of their, not just their psychological condition, but even their health condition. There's been empirical research that shows that medically they're healthier. It doesn't mean that they're suddenly, you know, their arthritis disappears. It just means that their medical condition and their physical condition improves as well as their psychological condition, just the idea that they've had exposure to, some of these pets. Same kind of thing with children, with disabilities, like autistic children, for example. Giving autistic kids animals to bond with and animals to identify with can have a tremendously positive effect in terms of, the child, that autistic child's ability to, come out of his or her shell or those kinds of things. So lots of really good examples there in terms of some of these one-time case studies. Seemed like there was another one that I wanted to mention. Oh yeah, another one I wanted to mention was family counseling, where, one of those, where you, again, I'm not gonna say you guys can't come to counseling, you guys can come to counseling. But a lot of times, obviously, what they do is, after families have gone through family counseling, they then observe or give them interviews or something like this about how are you doing now, do you guys get along better, do you have less friction, are you better able to resolve your issues, are you happier as a family, these kind of things, or marriage counseling as well. A lot of these kinds of things might even be as simple as exit interviews. An exit interview is something you do after people have been through some kind of program or something like this, an interview after the fact, but it's still an observation in terms of how he's doing. And some of these would be later down the line. These people all went through family counseling, let's get a hold of them in 6 months or a year and see how are you doing now. And, this becomes some real strong empirical support, for some of these kinds of counseling examples and things like that. You could envision too, with your, even with your one-time case study, you could envision a before and after, where it was 01, X1, 02, but it was just kind of an individual case study. One of the examples that I had down that I was going to mention was, if you're looking at the openness of a couple's communication before they get into counseling, and compare that with the openness of their communication after they've been to counseling. Or another example would be looking at some characteristic of a couple's communication before they make a commitment, like getting engaged or getting married, and then after they've made a commitment. Does their communication change after they've made some kind of commitment in terms of the longevity of their relationship, before and after? Another kind of study that is interesting and would be interesting here is parent or couple's communication before they have children and a couple's communication after they have children. Not just like how happy are you or satisfied, but in terms of characteristics and things like that. Or the amount of quality time that you have as a couple before your kids are born, compared with the amount of quality time you think you have after your kids are born. And it doesn't always go down. I mean, obviously what a lot of couples do is they still have as much quality time, it's just not, now your kids are part of the quality time. You have quality time as a family, not just necessarily quality time, individually as a couple. And this kind of design right here, you could, also label, if you wanted to, you could label this as a single group pre-test, post-test, or one group pre-test, post-test in terms of some of my examples. One group pre-test, post-test. So the examples that I just gave you about the couple before marriage, after marriage, or before commitment, after commitment, those kind of things, that's really more of a one group pre-test, post-test. It's still essentially a case study. It's just that you have a pre-test, post-test rather than just, studying them after the fact. And again, there's other variations on the themes as well. Oh, there's one other example that two other quick examples I wanted to mention in terms of the one-time case study, where you would have an X1 and an X2. And this one is a little different here. This is an example, but it's still a variation on the same theme, where these aren't representative of different people. It's the same people, the same subjects. Two examples come to mind, and again, I was talking about this last night in 310, and I talk about this in 110. There's been a lot of research done showing that babies can recognize their mother's voice already, right away, after birth. And so, the way that this study is obviously done, it's still for the same babies, but you take the newborn infants, relatively newborn infants, have them listen to their mother talk, have the same babies listen to another woman talk. It has to be a woman, otherwise it could be a difference in the male-female, not just a difference in the particular female. And then they observe the reactions of the babies. And what these studies have conclusively shown is that the babies respond more favorably and are more comforted by their mother's voice than by some other woman's voice. And what that conclusively proves is, and there's many other studies that have shown the same kind of thing, is that in the prenatal stage, the baby's processing the mother's voice. Now again, the tonal qualities are different because the acoustics has to travel through the embryonic fluid, and you have other kind of vibrations and stuff like that going on in the body. But what the baby is really recognizing in all likelihood is the rhythmic speech pattern of the mother compared to other women. So it's still a one-time case study, but it's the same people in both of these, the same babies. You're just listening to your mother talk, and what's your reaction? Listening to another woman talk, and what's the reaction? Another variation on that same theme, again, I talked about last night in 310, and I talked about in the 110 class, there's been research done showing that babies, when a mother reads a story aloud in the latter part of pregnancy, before the baby's born, that the baby will more favorably respond and be more comforted by that story that was read in the prenatal stage after the baby's born. Same kind of thing here. Let's say, and again, one particular study, they actually had a group of pregnant women read a particular story for so many weeks before the babies were born, and then they tested them after the babies were born, and they found that when the baby is listening to that story that the mother read before the baby was even born, there's a more positive, more comforting reaction in the babies than when they're listening to another story. Now, a particularly fascinating thing about that study was, it wasn't just when the mother read the story, it's when even somebody else read the story, the babies responded in a more favorable way. So what that means is, not only are the babies recognizing the rhythmic pattern of the mother's voice, they're even recognizing some linguistic pattern of the words of the story itself. So it's a pretty fascinating thing. So it's still a one-time case study, it's just a variation on a theme, because you've got the same babies here in both of these. It's just you're observing these babies' reaction to this as a one-time case study, and you're comparing it with their reaction to this. Two different voices, two different stories, that kind of thing.
Oh, no, since you're talking about babies, I think it's also cool how, like, even if, like, the baby, because I have a cousin, and my cousin's girlfriend actually is a twin, and when she would watch, like, when her sister would watch my little cousin, he would still cry like the fool, and then once, like, she got him back, like, he would be fine, but you think he'd be able to, like, not be able to recognize their twins, but he knew that that wasn't his mom. I think that's kind of
Absolutely. And I know a lot of fathers get kind of bummed at this because, a lot of times your newborn, the young babies, they're not as comforted by the father's voice as the mother's, and for a lot of fathers, it's like, well, don't you love me too? And it's not that babies don't like their dads as much or anything like that, it's that they've been processing the mother's voice for, how many weeks or months before they're born, and the dad's voice is pretty new. Now you can, and I actually recommend this in my 110 class for, eventual fathers, is maybe get down, press your mouth against the mother's stomach and talk to the baby. And the baby's not going to hear it as clearly, and they're not going to hear it as often, but at least when the baby's born, it's not going to be something that's completely unfamiliar to them. It'll at least have some effect, but you're never going to be able to equal what the mothers are at birth. So what does that say for fathers? Spend a lot of time with the kids after they're born, because you have some time to make up for it. Yeah.
Unless you're in the military.
What did you say?
Unless you're in the military. My dad was not around during the pregnancy or after I was born.
So there's not much you can do there.
No, there's
Record
not
the
much
voice.
you can do.
Record the voice and stick the speaker on your stomach or something like that. There is one other type of experimental design that we want to mention here. I'm not going to be able to get all of this out, but let me at least mention it. And that's a factorial design. The difference with a factorial design is you have more than one independent variable. I don't know if any of you have noticed, but in every one of the examples we've been mentioning so far, we only have one independent variable. We might have multiple different levels of the variable, like 35 languages, but it's still just one variable, and that's language. You might have 3 different sources of campaign information, but it's still one variable, which is source of information. So a factorial design is where you have more than one independent variable. Now, there's a lot to be said on factorial designs, and there's a certain, like, statement that you read, like, 3x2 factorial design and some things like that. I'm not gonna try to do that in 2 minutes. So this is where we'll pick up on Tuesday though, and we'll try to finish this relatively quickly and then move into our stuff on content analysis. So we have one more here.
Listen here, Giggly Bits.